This is Unit 2.2, the Monroe Doctrine and the Mexican War. We have two themes, Theme 1, the Monroe Doctrine, and Theme 2, Oregon, Texas Revolution, and the Mexican War. Let's start with Theme 1, the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is essentially the United States claiming the entire Western Hemisphere. This guy here is Uncle Sam. He represents the United States. These guys are all Europeans. If you notice here, there's a little flag. This is the British flag. This is probably France. This guy looks like Italy. Oh, this is probably France. That's probably Spain, right? And they're on the Eastern Hemisphere, and the United States is on the Western Hemisphere. And then we have the hat here, which is the Monroe Doctrine. And you use a hat to cover things that you want to protect or cover things that you want to claim. And notice that it's nicely claiming Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine is early 19th century foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine was an attempt to limit the role of European countries in the Western Hemisphere. The European countries still had colonies in the Americas, even after the American Revolution. In fact, after the Napoleonic Wars, which ended around 1815, we bought the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon. The monarchs wanted to reestablish control within the Western Hemisphere. When Latin American countries broke away from Spain, they developed strong trade relationships with Britain. So when the Spanish and the French want to come back in and start controlling those countries again, Britain wants to make sure that that doesn't happen. So the British were actually hoping the United States would help protect trading opportunities and would oppose any attempts by the Spanish to reestablish their Latin American colonies. So the British and the Americans were actually working together. Now, the United States was a bit nervous as well. Part of the issue with the Monroe Doctrine is that it's only 10 years after the War of 1812 with Britain. Nationalism is at an all-time high, and the Americans are nervous that Europeans might attempt to move in on what Americans thought was their territory, which means the entire North American continent. So this Monroe Doctrine is actually manifest destiny in foreign policy. The idea is that it was the U.S.'s God-given right to take over the North American continent, and the Monroe Doctrine was sort of calling dibs on the entire North American continent. But it was largely an empty threat. The War of 1812 had reaffirmed our independence, but it wasn't really an overwhelming victory. The British just got tired of fighting. We got tired of fighting. The British actually burned down the Washington, D.C. So it was by no means an overwhelming victory. The United States was actually quite weak militarily when the doctrine was issued. In fact, the United States was relying mostly on Britain to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. So it's interesting how 10 years made a difference here. So if it's not important in 1820 or so, why is it important in the 20th century? Well, the United States didn't really do much with the Monroe Doctrine before the Civil War. After the Civil War, however, around 1900, the United States starts to move beyond its continental borders. The United States used the Monroe Doctrine to justify actions by Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson when they went in and interfered with Latin America. Teddy Roosevelt even adds this corollary, we call it, of all things, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, that stated that the United States would act as European debt collectors in Latin American countries. Again, trying to keep Europeans away from the Western Hemisphere. This breeds a lot of resentment from Latin Americans. Woodrow Wilson is also going to get his nose involved in Mexico to try to teach them to elect good men. And eventually the Monroe Doctrine is going to keep us out of World War I. And that's it for Theme 1. We'll pick up Theme 2 in a second.